All right, so last week we spent quite a bit of time on looking at time, and I appreciate Aaliyah took some of my scribble scratch and then expanded it on these handouts. You get one, I think it looks a lot better than what I gave to you, but hopefully these are things that you can continue to look at and study, so we appreciate Aaliyah doing that and sharing that with us. All right, so as we move into the actual process of building a structure of a timeline of the events of the last week of Christ, a little over a week, but that's what we're going to attempt to do moving forward. And so as we do that, we're looking at the week leading up, and I want to begin at the Friday/Saturday, about a week before his crucifixion, and some of the activities that were ongoing during that week. It's amazing when you sit down and you study the Gospels how much is packed into those last few days, especially when you read the Gospel of John. This is one of the things that really comes out. This latter half of John really does center on this week. The first 11 chapters that you read are about the 2 to 3 years leading up to this week. And even that is condensed quite a bit into the last year of his ministry. But then when you get to chapter 12 and on, that's really that week. And the main focus being those last 4 days of his life here on earth, or those days surrounding the resurrection. So that's what we're going to look at. Now, we're going to start in John chapter 12. We're going to spend some time there in John 12. And if you turn in your Bibles there, verse 1 lets us know a couple of things. Number one, you'll note a time frame. So verse 1 says, this is English Standard Version, 6 days before the Passover, Jesus therefore came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. So, before we get into the events of that period, we note a couple of important things. Number one, he gives us a time, right? We're 6 days prior to the Passover. So when would the Passover be celebrated? Will it be the following Friday? And so we're at that Friday, Saturday time period with Jesus being at the house of Lazarus. Now that was in Bethany. Bethany was one of the communities surrounding Jerusalem. And here he is in the home of Lazarus. Now who is this Lazarus we're talking about? Mary and Martha's brother. What else do we know about Lazarus? He had just raised him from the dead just not too long before. One of the interesting things is, if you continue reading the text notes, he's there talking about those events with Lazarus. Can you imagine that conversation? I mean, that's kind of interesting in itself. And so there he is. We're just a week out, and look at what's going on. So let's continue on. Verse 2. So they gave a dinner for him there. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those reclining at the table. Mary therefore took a pound of expensive ointment made from pure nard, that's a perfume, anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But Judas Iscariot, one of the disciples, one of his disciples, who was about to betray him, said, "Why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?" He said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief, and having charge of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. Jesus said, "Leave her alone, so that she may keep it day of my burial. For the poor you always have with you, but you do not always have me. Sorry about that. So I'm not going to get into the Judas stuff. Sunday morning, that's what we're dealing with there. But I do want to note this interesting interaction. So you've got Jesus there. He's in the home with some dear friends, and they're talking about what? Talking about resurrection. Isn't that interesting? They're talking about the concept of resurrection. Here you've got a man, Lazarus, who died, but now is alive again. I mean, that's got to be kind of an overwhelming conversation to have. I'm sure there's lots of questions that Jesus is fielding that the text just simply doesn't give us. And then you have Mary do this thing, and I'm not really sure why she chooses to do it. But she, on some inspiration, has decided to wash the feet of Jesus and to anoint them with perfume. And then Jesus makes an interesting statement, doesn't he? In verse number 7, what does he say?
Leave her alone so that she may keep it for the day of my burial.
Yeah, so what might he be indicating by that?
He's getting ready to die.
He's getting ready to die. And that's something he's been trying to communicate to his disciples for a while. What would be perfume's use with burial? Well, they didn't. So there was a lot that would go into that process. Today we have a very different process than they would use, but there was a process they would use with perfumes and different things for odor, right? That would help to nullify those things, which is interesting. Is Jesus in the tomb long enough to smell? No. It's fascinating if you go back to earlier in John when he does raise Lazarus. If you go back to chapter 11 and verse 39, what does Martha say to Jesus about Lazarus?
That he may be smelling by now because he's been in the grave for 4 days.
Yeah, so you remember Jesus took an extra day to get there, and he did that on purpose. He wanted it to be the 4th day. But she's like, it's been 4 days. Don't take the stone away. It's going to smell. And so, of course, he has them go ahead and do it. But it's interesting. They understood that about death. There's some realities about a body that's been entombed for that long. And so here in chapter 12, you have her anointing him with this perfume, this ointment. There's a lot to say, and we've talked about already, like I said on Sunday, about the perfume and about Judas's reaction. We'll save that for that. But I do think that's interesting. So this is we're a week out, and then this happens. Just later on, I'm not trying to be grotesque, but when we think about Jesus' crucifixion, what does Peter allude to in quoting the prophets about the body of Christ? What does he say God will not allow to happen? What?
A bone that's broken.
Okay, with the crucifixion he says no bones will be broken. But what about the body in the tomb?
It won't decay.
We won't see corruption. And what does that mean? When he says he won't allow Holy...
It won't decay.
Yeah, so going back to this odor thing, why does a body have odor? Decay, right? There's things going on with the body. As it decays, it creates this odor to it. And that's one of the things, that's one of the reasons they would use that. Yes?
It's kind of follow the same pattern that the Passover lamb, what they did share, that was to be burned in fire. So it was,
And it had to be burned before when?
pardon me?
When did it have to be burned by?
Fire.
No, when?
Oh, right after you.
Before morning, right? It had to be done that night.
Right.
And God was very specific about that. It had to be done that night. You ate what you ate, and then you were to deal with the other stuff before morning. Because there's natural processes, and God understands that, and he had them do that. Well, here you've got her anointing Jesus' feet with oil. And he says she's doing this as a burial, as to prepare for my burial. What's on Jesus' mind? What's on Jesus' mind?
Crucifixion.
It's crucifixion.
Yeah.
You can tell it's on his mind and heart. He's thinking that his direction is toward the cross. He is focused on that. Yes, ma'am.
Well, that's what I was going to say about his focus is on that cross. And I mean, even you think about how disturbed he was in the garden about what he knew he was going to do. You know, you can think, I mean, it's not like that was just a one-night situation. So, I mean, he probably just appreciated a little love and care and concern from a friend. I mean, whether or not she understood all of his meaning, I'm sure she saw his distress too. And maybe that's why she felt like this was a worthy cause to give him some comfort.
Yeah, and so and there's something about some of the other disciples that were around Jesus that at times had a better, appears as though, let me say it that way, appear to have a better understanding of Jesus than the men do, the women around him. And I want you to notice something. If you go back to the previous chapter, if you go back, so in verse 17, the text tells us that Lazarus has passed. He's been dead now for 4 days in the tomb. Jesus gets to Bethany, and Martha meets him. All right, so verse 20, Martha meets him on the road. Of course, she's upset. Verse 21, she says, if you'd been here, he wouldn't have died. But even now I know whatever you ask from God, God will give you. Then verse 23, notice the response. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. I love her response. Sometimes we get on to Martha about the way she treated Mary the first time. Remember when he was over at the house and Mary's Martha's working on the food and making sure everybody's taken care of him, and Mary's just sitting there at his feet listening. And sometimes we can get on Martha, but let's remember what Martha says here. So he says, he will rise again. Then verse 24, what does Martha say?
She don't know that. Yeah. She knows he'll be in the resurrection.
Yeah. Catch that. A lot of people don't know that, yet she has already intellectually grabbed the concept that there will be a day of resurrection. Now, it seems obvious to me, is she's pointing toward the last resurrection. That's what she's thinking about. Now, of course, when Jesus says he'll rise again, what does Jesus mean?
In a few months.
Yeah, I'm getting ready to bring him back up.
Wow.
But she doesn't quite get that. But what she does understand is that there will be a final resurrection. So you start to see, even amongst the disciples, there are different levels of understanding. And there are things that the women get. We'll see this in Mary Magdalene too. There's some things that she gets that some of the other disciples have a little bit they've got to work a little harder at. But I love her response. She says, I know he'll rise again in the last day, right? In the resurrection. And so they've already conceptually gathered that. And of course, what would go on to happen is Jesus would resurrect Lazarus back to the physical body right after that. So, chapter 12, we see Jesus, and it's fascinating that that event where John has that happen right before he's there in the home eating. And all of this is focused on the concept of resurrection. Resurrection. And so that's where Jesus is there. I just want to note this. I don't know if I have this. I don't have this up here on the board, but I got verse 9 picked. Go to verse 9. The text continues. This is John 12:9. When the large crowd of Jews learned that Jesus was there, they came not only on account of him, but also to see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. There's a lot of fascination around resurrection. Isn't that interesting? God planted, I don't say planted, that's not the right word, but he, the way he orchestrated these events, what are the people beginning to think about? Not just Jesus, but the people. The possibility of resurrection. That thought is just in the air of the people, like in the atmosphere surrounding Jesus. I don't think those things happen by accident. Verse 10, so the chief priests made plans to do what? They put Lazarus to death as well, because on account of him, many Jews were going away and believing in Jesus. I mean, if you witnessed that, that would be very hard to work your way around logically, to not believe in Jesus at that point. But why put him to death? Why put Lazarus to death? Quit talking. They see a vulnerability here, don't they? In what they're believing. Dwayne, do you have some?
Well, I was just going to say that, you were saying that everybody believed, and I think that the chief priests did too, but their position in the Jewish community was being threatened in their viewpoint.
Oh, yeah.
So now they're not only after Jesus himself, but we're after Lazarus, because obviously that's a huge amount of evidence that, okay, we know that guy was dead for 4 days, and all of a sudden he's not.
So,
and we don't have an explanation for that, other than what Jesus apparently actually did.
And this is a side note, and think about it for Sunday. Who's also at all of these things? Judas. And you see a real stark contrast between the way he's reacting and some of the others. So just think about that. He's there too. He knows what's going on as well. So you kind of have this mindset, resurrection, right? So that's going on Friday and into Saturday. And then Sunday, you're a week before the resurrection. So we're on Sunday. And what happens? All right, we're going to look at a couple of different texts here. Let's go to Matthew 21. This is recorded several times. If you go to 21 and you're looking at the beginning of that chapter, you have the triumphal entry of Jesus into Jerusalem. The text starts in verse 1 by saying, when they drew near to Jerusalem and came to Bethphage, which is, I believe, another name for Bethany, to the Mount of Olives, then Jesus sent 2 disciples, saying to them, go into the village in front of you, and immediately you will find a donkey tied, and a colt with her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, you shall say, the Lord needs them, and he will send them at once. This took place to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet, saying, say to the daughter of Zion, behold, your king is coming, humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, a foal of the beast of burden. So before we read the rest of it, so you've got this interesting interaction or this direction by Jesus where he says to the disciples to go. Now, what Matthew doesn't record here in the same kind of timeline as John. Remember, John's not recording necessarily for chronological order as much as Matthew. But so Matthew has not got he does not have all the same events lined out just the way John did. But in this instance, there's something Jesus having done to fulfill a prophecy. What was that prophecy?
The one in Matthew 21
Yes. What's the prophecy?
about the coming on a donkey and with the colts.
What's interesting about that?
It's not a symbol of royalty necessarily.
It's not a symbol of what?
Royalty.
Royalty.
It's very humble.
Very humble. I like that. You wouldn't expect a king to come into town on the back of a donkey, right? On the back of a young donkey. You would expect what from a king? In a chariot with a huge retina behind him of soldiers, right? Of other court officials. You'd expect a lot of pomp and circumstance. That's not what you see here. It's interesting that in the quotation here, he says that the king is coming to you humble and mounted on a donkey. Humble, that idea of meekness. And so you have a real stark contrast to what many would expect from a king. Just trying to...
Zechariah 9:9 is prophecy.
Yeah, that's what I was looking for. Thank you. Zechariah 9:9 is where that's pulling from. So Zechariah had prophesied about this, that these events would occur. And you may ask, well, why is Jesus doing all this? Well, I think, again, he's setting the contrast between himself and what the human mind would think a king would do. He's doing something that's very, very much the opposite of what most human beings would expect from a king. All right, so he says, "Go. You'll find the donkey and the colt. You're to ask the owner, and then when he says you can have them, you bring them to me." And that's what they do. So let's go down to verse number 6. The disciples went and did as Jesus had directed them, and they brought the donkey and the colt and put on them their cloaks, and he sat on them. Most of the crowd spread their cloaks on the road, and others cut branches from trees and spread them on the road. The crowds that went before him, that followed him, were shouting, "Hosanna to the Son of David, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, Hosanna in the highest." And when he entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred up, saying, "Who is this?" And the crowd said, "This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth of Galilee." Now, reading this, I think there is a contrast that we need to consider. Who are those shouting out here? How are they described? Simply as crowds, right? Now later, after the mock trial of Jesus and the unfair conviction, what are the people doing? What are they crying out there? Crucify him, he's to blame, crucify him. They go on to say, may his blood be on our heads. In a week, the crowds go from singing his praise to asking for his crucifixion in a week. Interesting contrast there. And also, I think has something to say about the power of the influence of the mob and the mob mentality. And so they're crying out, they're crying out, Hosanna, the Son of David, blessed is he who comes. And so you have Jesus coming in a very humble way. This is where they lay out the palm branches and he enters into the city of Jerusalem one last time.
Was there anything that I'm missing as far as what would cause the crowd to turn against him?
Well, so as we get there, we'll discuss that more. But what is it? Let me throw it out to the crowd, and I'll give you my opinion about what this is. Why did they turn? Did Jesus do anything to make them turn?
No, it's the Pharisees provoking them, I think, from what I read.
Okay.
The Pharisees wanted them.
So if you look in Matthew, and as Matthew moves chronologically, what happens in Matthew 23?
to go to see Thomas,
What happens in Matthew 23?
Denounces the Pharisees.
He denounces them over and over, and he is very upfront and harsh with them. That word woe comes up a lot, doesn't it? You go back and read that. He is very condemning of their behavior, of their leadership. What do you think it's going to do to the Pharisees?
Make them upset.
They're going to be pretty upset. That's going to get them into a flaming uproar. They're upset, and then opportunity comes up. What's the opportunity? So number one, you have the passion with the Pharisees comes up, with the religious leaders. And then opportunity pops its head up. Where's the opportunity? Why have they not taken Jesus before? They've wanted to for a long time, but why haven't they not been able to?
They were afraid to cause an uproar among the people.
Yes, they never could catch Jesus alone. An opportunity appears. What's the opportunity? Judas, an inner circle disciple, says, I'll bring you to him. Passion meets opportunity. Now, a lot of times we talk about it in a positive way, right? You want to do something in your life, get passionate about it, opportunity will come. This is the reverse of that. Evil passion Satan will provide opportunity to fulfill your evil passion. So you have a group of individuals who are very upset at Jesus, feel very, might I say, probably feeling guilty as well because they know what he's saying is true, who are very motivated, now have opportunity. They arrest Jesus, and then what do?
Put them on trial.
They put him on trial, but they incite the crowd. They incite the crowd. How can a group of people go from cheering him and a week later to condemning him to death? I believe that explains a lot of what happened.
I think there might also have been some animosity when the crowd is realizing that, Jesus is not here to, reign on earth. He's not here to give them the kingdom that they are looking for, in their life.
Well, that's a great point too. Go to John chapter 6. Remember what happens? You may remember what happens with the 5,000. What did Jesus do? What does Jesus do with the 5,000? Feeds them with 2 fish and 5 loaves. After that was over, what did they do? No, they didn't leave him yet. They pursued him for the purpose of making him king. Not in a spiritual context, by the way. They were going to force him to lead their rebellion. He did not meet their expectations. And so there may have been some animosity about that as well, because they were looking for not spiritual liberty, but for what? Political liberty. And food. Yeah. You want to win in politics, promise. Promise, promise, promise. That'll win you more votes than anything. Promise people good things. Even if you can't deliver them. You don't have to necessarily deliver them. Just give them a few things. But he said, I'm not doing that. I'm not going to do that for you. And so he didn't meet their expectation. But it also says something about how we can get in the crowd. And so many people can get... Again, I've given this example before. There's an interesting psychological study from the Nazis in Germany. I've said this before, and it's true. Hitler was an evil man. But Hitler didn't kill all those people, did he? He had a lot of co-conspirators, didn't he? How could those people do that? I think it's the same principle here. There's been a lot of interesting studies on that. You should go back and read some of those, kind of how people get convinced to do something evil. There was what was it called? Had a name, but they did these scientific experiments with college students, and they would bring them in this room, and they'd set up this fake experiment where you'd have one person who was an actor, and then you'd have across from them on the other side of glass somebody who didn't understand. They were the, what would you call it, the lab rat, right, that they're testing on. And they'd have them give shock treatments to people. And the actor, would start out, they would start out giving them a little bit. And then the researcher would try to encourage them to give them more each time. And a lot of people would sit there and they would give them some, and then they'd encourage them, and they keep giving them, and they're seeing the person react. Now, they don't know that this isn't real. But it was interesting to see the number of people who would keep going on and not say, whoa, I'm not doing this. This is bad. Evil influence. Be careful with being persuaded through pressure, peer pressure. We can get caught up into it very easily. So I just wanted to note that contrast as we move forward. Two groups of people who make a stark change from celebrating Jesus to, in the end, condemning him to crucifixion. That didn't happen overnight, but it did happen pretty quickly. We see Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem, celebrated as what? As king. And that's an important thing that keeps coming up. All right, so as you get to the end of that, you see this. I've got Luke 19:41. It's also in Matthew 23, 37 and following. But we'll go to Luke 19 just so we get a little bit of all the Gospels as we move forward. But this is recorded in a couple of them. But what is Jesus doing here? Luke 19:41. This in Matthew's Gospel. So this is where, building a timeline, you've got to really take time to read each and put them where they need to be. Because remember, all the Gospels aren't necessarily worried about chronological order. John's definitely not. But so in Matthew's Gospel, where do you have the Jesus weeping over the people? It's after his woes to the to the Jewish leaders. Well, in Luke's gospel, where does it follow? In Luke's gospel, where does it follow? After the entry. And I think that's interesting that Luke puts it there. And it just falls right on the heels of his entry. And then as you're reading Luke, it's like him looking back at the people. And the text says in verse 41, "And when he drew near and saw the city, Jerusalem, he wept over it, saying, would that you, even you," talking about the Israelite people, the Jews, "had known on this day the things that make for peace." And he's talking about peace with God. "But now they are hidden from your eyes. For the days will come upon you when your enemies will set up a barricade around you and surround you and hem you in on every side and tear you down to the ground, you and your children within you, and they will not leave one stone upon another in you, because you did not know the time of your visitation." Now, Luke is being a lot more brief than what Matthew will be in 24. Matthew 24, he talks about the destruction of Jerusalem. Here, Luke is very succinct on this. But Jesus is looking back on Jerusalem, and he's mourning over her. Go over, I don't have this up on the board, but I do want to go back to Matthew 27 and look at what Matthew includes as he records this. I said 27, it's not 27, I'm sorry. Luke 23, not 27. Luke 23, 37. What is it that Matthew gives us? He says, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." And right after that, what does Matthew go into? Talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. So Matthew gives us a lot more information on that. But what's Jesus doing as he looks back?
He's weeping over Jerusalem.
Yeah, he's mourning. Here I've come. Here God has come to earth to walk among us. And yet what did Jerusalem do? Rejected him. How sad. I think it's important to see the emotion of Jesus here. This isn't something easy for him to say. And he's mourning over the fact here the very ones he came to save are the ones who want nothing to do with him. Despite them praising him just recently as he entered the city. But what does he know about them? This isn't going to last. That very shortly, those same people, they're not going to be praising me anymore. They're going to be calling for my death. Dwayne, and will end.
I was just going to say, it goes back to what they thought he was coming for with what he was doing. Again, once they found out that, hey, I'm not going to lead you and throw the Romans out, they just turned on him because they didn't understand.
Mm-hmm.
And when they turned on him, they didn't mess around.
No, they didn't. And that's right. And that's why it's interesting to look at the different levels of understanding, even within the disciples. As we move forward, we were talking about maturation earlier and how different people mature intellectually at different ages. Well, you kind of almost see that similar thing here where different disciples are getting stuff at different times. So that'll be kind of an interesting thing to think about as we move forward. Who gets it first and who doesn't? And some it takes a little while. Some never arrive. Any other questions, comments? Good discussion. We will continue this on as we move forward into the week. thinking about some of the things that are happening leading up to his betrayal and then death, burial, and resurrection. Thank you. We'll be dismissed and rejoined in just a minute for our devotional.